Can the Utah defense be top 10 in college football in 2024? And what kind of players should Utah men's basketball be targeting in the transfer portal currently? All that and more on today's Locked On Utes.
You are Locked On Utes, your daily podcast on the Utah Utes. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for making Locked On Utes your first listen every single day. We are available on all platforms, including YouTube and wherever you may get your podcast. If this is your first time listening to our show, make sure you like and subscribe. Love interacting with all of you in the YouTube comments as well as on social media, where you can follow our show at Locked On Utes on X today. Today's episode of Locked On Utes is brought to you by FanDuel. You can make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 with any winning $5 bet. You can visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. My name is JT Wistricll, former intern inside the University of Utah Athletic Department. Excited to be joined on today's episode of Locked On Utes by Andrew Crowley, host of the Runnin Hoops Podcast. And Andrew, when you're talking about this Utah defense, it's a unit I'm incredibly high on last year because they were incredibly good last year. This is a Utah defense that overall ranking-wise a season ago, they were 13th in yards per game. And I think they could genuinely be even better this coming season. Why do I think that? Easier schedule. No Caleb Williams. No Michael Penix. No Bo Nix. I think Shedeur Sanders is going to be really good this year. I do. But that's one of those guys. And not all of these guys who were just drafted in the first round of the NFL draft. So I think that will definitely help some of Utah's numbers for sure, too. Also, another thing that's definitely going to help this Utah defense, Andrew, the offense is going to be better. So the defense will be better rested in some of these games, too. And I'll also say this. The opponents, not just because of those quarterbacks as well, but just some of these offenses in general, I don't think they're as potent as some of the Pac-12 ones, not even just for quarterback's sake, but some of the running backs and offensive line wise. There are some good teams in the Big 12. Utah's missing a lot of them, though, too. They don't see Kansas. They don't see Kansas State in the regular season. They see Baylor at home instead. And I think we all know how that's probably going to go there, too. There's also just so much turning talent from this defense. This is a front seven that was fourth in rushing defense last year. Did they lose? Oh my gosh, I can't believe I blanked out his name for a second. Jonah Ellis. Did they lose Jonah Ellis? Yes. Jonah Ellis coming into the season. Connor O'Toole was already supposed to be the team's best pass rusher. And I'm not saying O'Toole's going to have an Ellis year. I don't think that's fair. But I don't think Jonah Ellis was a dominant run defender. I think he did his job, and I expect Connor O'Toole to come in and do his job, just like Van Fillinger did. So I expect that run defense to be there. And how much more evidence do we need, Andrew, that just no matter who is in the Utah secondary, they're going to produce? Because in Morgan Scalley and Sharif Shaw, we trust. They absolutely lock it down back there. And there's a lot of talent in that defensive backfield, too. And Morgan does a great job running the defense just in totality in general. The talent is there. The schedule's there. I think this can be a top 10 defense in 2024.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that you never really question about Utah football is the defense, and specifically, you know, that defensive line. And I don't know the names as well as a lot of folks do because I cover basketball largely. But I mean, it just seems like they're constantly reloading with guys that, you know, you've never heard of them, and then the next thing you know, they're a third-round pick a couple years later. I mean, and that is just the mark of a good Utah defense. It's interesting that you mentioned the schedule. You know, the Big 12 is known for that, you know, throwing the ball all around the yard. And so it's going to be interesting to see how Utah holds up against teams that are going to throw it 30, 40, 50 times a game, because you know you're going to get that with some of these teams. But I agree with you. You miss Kansas State, who is probably the closest team to Utah in the conference. Excuse me. Maybe Oklahoma State. But yeah, I mean, I think that all of the pieces are there. Specific, you know, especially in that back end where they've been banged up at the end of seasons before. I think all of the elements are there for this defense to really, really excel. And to your point about the offense, you know, some of these Big 12 teams aren't used to teams taking 3, 4, 5 minutes, you know, 8 minutes, right, to drive down the field. And I think that's exactly what Cam Rising, you know, Andy Ludwig is going to dial up there. And I think it's definitely a recipe for success in 2024.
Agree. This is an offense that, yes, has gotten more explosive. Dorian Singer, Damon Alford, I think, is going to be a really nice receiver for this Utah team. they're still going to be built on the methodical long drives a lot. Cam dropping in some short passes to move the chains to the tight ends in particular, and the running back still going to get you those 3 to 4 yards every play to slowly but surely wear down the other defense, dominate time of possession, keep that defense well rested too. And you mentioned this Utah defensive line. There is just so much depth along it. I mentioned Van Fillinger and Connor O'Toole already. The defensive tackle room that Utah has is just incredible. I mean, when you're talking about a Junior Tufuna pairing up with a Keanu Tanuvasa, when Samote Pepa, Licky by Mahi, and David Fotu are your backups, like what? Those guys would be starters at almost every other program, I feel like. And, Logan Fano, I think he's got a chance to get back and get healthy coming off the Achilles injury he suffered, which I'm really excited about his future and what he can do as a defensive end, because he had such, the fact he got hurt on a sack is still just like so heartbreaking. You're like, are you kidding me? Like, of all, and just the fact that he dealt with another season ending injury too, which also he suffered in camp at BYU too. So we'd love to see him back out there ready to go to other defensive end. You get a guy in, dang, I forgot his name, Utah State defensive end, Paul Fitzgerald. Paul Fitzgerald transfers over now too, so you get a guy like that without even mentioning a John Henry Daly, without even mentioning yet again all the developmental pieces that exist on this Utah defensive line. Linebacker punch of Lander Barton as well as Karene Reed, I think, is phenomenal. Both those guys can cover a little bit. We know they can blitz a little bit too. Exceptional tacklers, good sideline-to-sideline speed. The Leavani Damuni injury is definitely a big cloud. Like, okay, who's the next guy? But Utah didn't add anyone. And we'll see if that bites them. But I trust in Colton Swan in this linebacker group. That, Sione Fotu's getting back, settled in, coming off the mission. So I expect him to potentially have a really good year as the third linebacker if called upon too. And Zemiah Vaughn is back in the secondary. You got your top corner. Keenan Johnson figures to be a big transfer addition to this team who's played a lot of football. Smith Snowden, it's felt like for a little bit ever since he committed to Utah, he was going to be next and have one of those guys. And Utah has a lot of safety talent in that room. You got a guy in Gilman, right, who started a lot for Stanford. He came over, and now he's fighting for a job because Teo Johnson, former wide receiver, turned defensive back last year, who played a lot for Utah. He's been so good as a safety that he's already locked down one of the starting spots according to Kyle Whittingham. So that leads Nate Ritchie, a guy who's already started a lot for Utah before his mission, and then he needed a year to get his legs back under. Looked really good in the bowl game. Speaking of the bowl game, Jonathan Hall looked fantastic. And there are other depth pieces I could have even highlighted off of that. Andrew, this defense is simply put loaded.
Absolutely loaded. I mean, you list off all of those names, and it's like, oh yeah, that guy. Oh yeah, that guy. Oh yeah, that guy. Like they're absolutely loaded, and you can't wait to see him take the field. That's for sure. And I know we're talking about defense, but let's not forget my guy transferring in, Caleb Lohner. Right?
Hey, yes.
He finally goes full circle and ends up back at Utah as a tight end of all things, right? It's a pretty incredible story there too.
It's incredible. I'll say, for you, do you think he's going to make a bigger impact on the basketball court or on the football field?
Ooh, well, that's a tough one. I think he's going to get a couple of jump ball opportunities in football. I'd love to see him, I say this sort of tongue in cheek, but I'd love to see him right in the middle of that field goal block, with his 7-foot wingspan or what.
That's something people have said. It's true.
But I do think he's going to provide some much needed depth and toughness at the right time when Big 12 play starts. And I know we're going to get into that a little bit here later in the show, but I think he's got a chance to have an impact on the football field and just kind of be just another wrinkle, right, for Andy Ludwig in his bag of tricks that he's got down on the goal line. I mean, imagine having all of those weapons at your disposal.
Luxury. That's why I think it's going to be really hard for him to play. I think he's going to be used more basketball-wise just because Utah's got Brant Keithy. They have Carson Ryan, and I think Landon King is really good too. Mickey Sugadraga has been more of the blocking guy too, but obviously there is trust with Caleb Lohner, with Kyle Whittingham, with Fred Whittingham and the staff to try, and to me this is more than anything him getting his start to learn the ins and outs of the tight end position to then get an opportunity with an NFL team and hopefully try to grow from there like a Mark Vital tried to do with the Kansas City Chiefs after his time with Baylor concluded. So it's going to be very interesting to see. And I will also add this for your point about field goal block. Connor O'Toole blocked a big extra point in Utah's game against Washington last year. You know what Connor O'Toole has? A crazy long wingspan. Basketball players kind of have those too, especially ones who are 6'8". I think Caleb Lohner could genuinely have a chance to be a guy who's able to block some field goals. And I'm curious to see what he's going to do. But he is going to I think he will be a guy that can help the basketball team as well too. And I want to talk about the Utah men's basketball team because even though they got Loner, they've gotten some other nice pieces. They still have a lot of work they need to do in the transfer portal. And that's what I want to talk about, is where the work still needs to be done throughout the transfer portal and positions. We'll talk about a player, but especially positions and needs that this team has, Andrew. We're going to be discussing all of that in one moment. But first, I want to talk to you all about our friends at FanDuel Sportsbook. It's winner take all time in the NBA and NHL, and FanDuel is giving you a shot to bring home a big win of your own. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 to bet on spreads, money lines, player props, and more. You can visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make every playoff shot count. Man, the playoffs have been fun. My Minnesota Timberwolves and the Denver Nuggets have been battling it out in one heck of a series right now. Donovan Mitchell's injury seems it's really put a damper on the Cleveland series right now. What Luka and the Mavs are doing has been fun and impressive to watch. But this Knicks-Pacers series is one I haven't been able to take my eyes off of either. All these great NBA playoff games. If you guys got a lean on how you think they're going to go, why not try to make some cash on it? So head over to FanDuel today. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. All righty, Andrew, I got a question for you. Who to you is the targets position-wise that Utah needs to find? I'll really quick say, I think Utah could really use an experienced combo guard. That's the one thing I really look at that I'd love to see Utah add. Where do you lean right now?
Right now, yes. I mean, the combo guard is obviously a major position of need for Utah, for anybody going into the Big 12, right? Mm-hmm. If you go look at Big 12 rosters, which I've got a whole spreadsheet. I've been nerding out on Big 12 basketball. It's like a 70-30 split on those rosters of guards versus bigs. And so you absolutely have to have some really solid guard play if you're going into the Big 12. Fortunately for Utah, they added a guard in Miro Little from Baylor, who's got some Big 12 experience, not a ton, but he was in a Big 12 program, a successful Big 12 program. So you like that. But yeah, I would lean slightly to combo guard, and then power forward would be the next one. Like a guy that's not going to come in and replace Brandon Carlson, because Brandon Carlson's a bit of a unicorn when it comes to his skill set at Utah, right? A 7-footer who can step out and shoot it, and in some cases is better away from the basket than he is with his back to the basket. But yeah, so guard and then power forward. And I think they're at least a little bit closer on a couple of guys in the front court that are at least going to be making decisions here within the week on whether or not they are going to go play at Utah.
Yeah, which will be big, something to monitor what everything is going on with the transfer portal for this team. Just other things I said I wanted a combo guard. If you want to get them separately, that's fine by me too. If they wanted to go out there and find a playmaking guard, that's a huge plus. You lost Raleigh Wooster, Davon Smith too. How about a scoring guard? I'd love like a 6-man who could come in, or maybe even he's a starter, and a guy like Miro, maybe he's the guy who comes in as the playmaker. Maybe he learns a year under the experienced guy. I think there's a lot of good possibilities there. Love that you mentioned a forward. I just think that's something that this team needs to do, is get more athletic as they enter the Big 12, which is full of some exceptional athletes and just some teams that are capable of getting up and down the court too. And yeah, I mean, obviously, I think Lawson Lovering did a good job too, but you need to bring in more competition for Keller, a guy who had a good game against Utah last year, but for a lot of his college career, hasn't panned out the way he's hoped. He's got the potential to be good. You know what sharpens iron? Iron. Go get another really strong power forward center type of player to bring in and match up with him too. And, those are what we think Utah should look for right now, but it is interesting kind of monitoring everything going on, because you got a team like Utah that is targeting 2024 4-star guard Jace Butler after his Illinois release. And this comes to us from Austin Eames, who's a friend of the show at Fan Nation All Utes. He's ranked as the number 30th overall player at his position coming out of the University of Illinois. And this is a guy who's got some elite intangibles and potential talent too. When you're looking at him, 6'4", 180 pounds. He was originally verbally committed to Washington, as we talked about, kind of at Illinois now too. Cal, Utah, and Stanford are among those expected to be in play. But this is the type of guy with the potential, which is big. That's what Utah's been looking at, right? Miro's got potential. Keller's got potential. Dawes has potential. There's another guy with potential that I think would be a good get, Andrew.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, I mean, anytime you can add some, that level of a dynamic player to your backcourt, you do it. And especially if they're young, right? Like, obviously you want experience. Experience wins in college basketball. But if you can have a guy that can spend a couple of years in your program and you can take care of him with NIL and all of that stuff, it's absolutely something that can change the trajectory of your program. 100%.
Yeah, that's what Utah is going to be hoping is the case for them too. And we talked about the potential. Andrew, let's talk a little bit about the guys they've gotten. I haven't gotten a chance to get your thoughts on them. Who is the best get, in your opinion, for Utah so far in the transfer portal additions that they've made?
Ooh, that's a good question. I would go probably to Miro Little, only because I think he's going to get 25, 30 minutes a game at that starting point guard position. I think he's going to be a guy that steps right in and plays. I love the addition of Mason Madsen. Had him on the podcast last week, and he's a guy that's going to be a fan favorite like almost immediately. He's got, to our knowledge, to my and Mason's collective knowledge, he's got the only skydiving NIL deal that's out there in college basketball. He's going on a skydiving jump here later on this month, and he's just, between him and Gabe, like the last ride of the Madsen brothers. I think that's going to be, really, really awesome. Keanu Dawes is a kid that, Utah was his dream school growing up. He ends up at Rice, playing closer to home, doesn't have the resources at Rice that he's going to have at the University of Utah. Craig talks all the time about they monitor how many shots these guys are getting up, how much time they're spending in the gym. Obviously Coach O, their strength and conditioning coach, is with these guys a lot. I really, really like Keanu Dawes' potential. And then, rounding out the guys who have committed, Zach Keller, he's another one of these solid guys, 4-star out of high school. Things just didn't quite go his way at Wake Forest, but you saw in the game against Utah, he's got some potential. And I think, he's got some familiarity also playing with Lawson Lovery and Jake Wallin with the Utah prospects. And so I think that's going to help him as well. And so I really like all of the additions. I think Miro's the biggest impact because they needed a guard, right? Somebody that can distribute the ball, maybe score a little bit for them. But, I actually really do like a lot of these additions.
Quality ones too. I think there's a reason, like we mentioned, they need you mentioned a forward, I mentioned a scoring guard like that, is you just need that little more scoring punch, right? It's a fact that Utah has one guy on their roster who in last collegiate basketball season averaged more in double figures. That's Gabe Madsen, and that's it. So that's where this team does need to continue to do works, right? And you're talking about a Utah team that they had 3 players who scored in double figures. Madsen's the only one who's coming back, haven't replaced him with proven commodities. And let's also say this Utah had a few players had averaged 5 or more points per game for them, and only 2 of them are back on the roster in Lawson Lovering and Gabe Madsen. So that's where there is still a lot up in the air for the team to add. But I agree. I think a lot of these guys have potential to be key depth pieces. Some of them will start. You said Little. I think that makes a ton of sense because of his experience with the Finnish national team as well too. The flashes he showed at times at Baylor, and Baylor was an NCAA tournament team, so playing behind those veteran experienced guards that Baylor always has, never a bad thing. And I think he's got a chance to start for this Utah team. I'll go Dawes for the one I'm the most excited about right now because another one, right? Just a freshman. I like the length that he offers. We already talked about wingspan a little bit. Played in 32 of the team's games, started in 23 of those games last fall for the Owls. Averaged 6 and 4 last year, around 23 minutes. He just seems like a prime guy to grow because of the amount of experience he's already gotten last year. I feel like he might be a little ahead of Little in his development because of that, but that national team experience is real, so that could give Little heads up too. So those are the proven basketball players that we know for sure are going to play basketball. Andrew, let's go to Loner. I think this can be especially after Utah lost Kaba. This is a really good get to me when you're bringing some added physicality. If there's one thing we know about Caleb Lohner and his crazy college basketball career that hasn't probably panned out as he's hoped, that's why he's going to football, he can bring the physicality.
Oh, yeah. I mean, you talk about a guy, we spent 10 minutes talking about that Utah defense. Here's a guy that's going to spend 6 months going up against that Utah defense in practice, even if he never sees the field in a game, which I don't think is, realistic. I think we'll see him at some point.
Yeah,
he's going up against those guys in practice every day. He's 6'8". He's all of 235, I think. Just big, bulky kid. He's one of these guys that, when Utah lost him, and then the first time I saw him on the court playing down south at BYU, I was like, holy cow, this guy's got a college-ready body, and he's only improved that in his, collegiate career. And so I love the toughness. I love the toughness and the physicality that he brings to the front court. And like I said earlier, the timing of his addition is going to be key for them. When can they get him? I can't remember when the college football championship game is, but that's probably right after when he's going to be, when he'll join the team, because that's where Utah will be, is in the CFP championship game, right? So, mid-January, something like that. But yeah, I love that. Let me give you a stat about your guy, Keanu Dawes.
All right.
95% of the three-pointers that he was assisted on, he made, right? So when he had a chance to spot up and shoot off of an assist, 95% of those went in. So it just speaks to your point that if we can get him some good set shots, get him in a rhythm, he's going to knock those down. He's going to show that potential that's way far beyond 6 and 4 that he did last year.
A fantastic point. That's a great stat there. And it's going to be interesting to see if he can keep that up in the Big 12. And speaking of the Big 12, Andrew, let's talk about where this Utah team currently projects in the Big 12. If you're talking about what their best case scenario and probably the more realistic one, I think there's a world with right now what's on the roster. That's what we have to talk about. We're not going to say when Utah adds this guard like that, because we don't know at the time we're recording this what's going to be on Utah's roster still. So as it pertains to this topic for what Utah is going to do right now, I think there's a world where Little and Dawes and the Madsen bros, I think there's a world everything comes together and Utah's can get up to 8, 9, 10, maybe in the Big 12. I think there's a chance that everything comes together and that can happen. The more realistic outcome, probably based on what's there right now and how good the conference is they're probably somewhere in that bottom 5. I do not think they will be one of the worst teams. I think Oklahoma State's got some things they're figuring out, Cincinnati as well. And I do think there's some good talent here. And I like the coaches that Utah has. But first year in the Big 12, there is obviously just a different in talent level when you have so many Big 12 teams that were in the NCAA tournament last year and that are predicted to get back there, where Utah currently is not based on what's on their talent. So I think there's a world they can get in the top 10, but is barely squeaking in. But bottom 5 is probably more realistic is the way I see it right now.
Yeah, I think you'd have to say that right now with 4 roster spots open, and with Kansas, fish in a barrel, right? Like they just point at somebody and they say, "Hey, do you want to come play here?" And they say yes. And how many stars do they have next to their name? 5. So this is a completely different world of basketball talent, coaching, and recruiting. The Pac-12 was a conference where it didn't lack for talent per se, because you look at the last 10 years of NBA drafts, there's Pac-12 players all over it, but the league on the whole kept coaches around way too long, right? Guys like Jared Hass at Stanford, Wayne Tinkle at Oregon State, Andy Enfield just got out at USC, I think a year before he was going to get probably fired. You know what I mean? So the coaching talent in the Big 12 is ridiculous. And so it's one of those things where there's no nights off, and you've got to bring your A game or something close to it every single time. And they've announced that they're going to have 20 games in conference, and so it's going to be a handful. I'm right there with you. Right now, if everything goes well, if they get a little Huntsman magic, going, and they can pick some teams off, maybe they can get into that top 10. Otherwise, I think you are looking at a team that's going to have to, do some damage, in a conference tournament or whatever to try to, get themselves into position for the postseason. Now, all that said, this is also a league where you can go 500 in the league, or maybe even 2 games under 500 and still, make a postseason tournament. So I think the margin for error in a league like the Big 12 is a little bit bigger, but at the same time, it's still going to be a war, night in and night out. That's for sure.
To your point about Huntsman magic, this Utah team needs to be as good as they can at home, because we know about how they've kind of fared on the road as of late. We'd love to see them kind of get rid of those road demons, and even if they're a step up in the right direction, still might be too much for them to crack the NCAA tournament. So going to be something very interesting to watch and to see when the Runnin Utes compile the rest of their roster and get back out there later this fall. Andrew, we always appreciate you stopping by. Great numbers and stats as always, my friend. And if you guys want to hear more of Andrew, where should they all head over to?
Yeah, Runnin Hoops Podcast, wherever you get a podcast. Follow me over on X at Runnin Hoops. I've already got interviews with incoming players, Keanu Dawes and Mason Madsen have got one coming up with Zach Keller and Chira Evans on the women's side of things, and plenty more content throughout the summer as well. Current players, former players, anyone connected with the program, lots of good stuff. Give us a follow over there at Runnin Hoops.
Thank you again for stopping by. Great stuff.
Yep.
That's going to do it for today's edition of Locked On Utes. We'll be back with you soon talking more things Utah football and Utah athletics.